can you give me
On a
the
screen.
ability to
I'm
share?
gonna share with you to share the screen. I apologize so much, guys. Okay, I'm going to make you the host. There you go.
It's,
Paul Refuah Shleima, you look great.
thank you. Okay, welcome everybody. I hope you can see. Yes, I think you can now see the slides. Welcome. So this is the first in a series of shiurim. We'll have two before Rosh Hashanah, one on Rosh Hashanah itself. If you happen to be at the Kehillah of Riverdale for Rosh Hashanah, you can join in. But these two will also be sufficient on their own to give some kind of, to convey some kind of point that I'm trying to make. And the title of the series is Forgiving, Forgetting, Forgoing, Transcending Judgment with Rav Moshe Cordovero's Tomer Devorah. And the cover slide here features a great image taken from an article by my Yale colleague Ronan Bustan, and it is Deborah under the palm tree from a 5th century mosaic found at Hukok, which is pretty astonishing stuff. That we haven't seen everything that's there at Hukok, but there's some amazing images of women, of Deborah and Yael. So I want to start with a moment that got me thinking about forgiveness. And it had to do with Lord Jacobowitz, who was the chief rabbi of Great Britain and the Commonwealth, someone to whom I was quite close at the time. And there was a parliamentary act, kind of a very unusual parliamentary act called the War Crimes Act of 1991. It was a very controversial piece of legislation at the time, and it basically allowed prosecution of war criminals for acts that were committed in Nazi or Nazi-occupied areas by people who later became British citizens or residents. So obviously, part of the controversy was legal, that it's unusual to prosecute crimes under laws that did not apply to the person at the time when they committed the crimes. And that's not a very straightforward situation. But there was also a lot of ethical debate at the time. And I recall watching an interview of the chief rabbi by, I can't remember, I've not been able to find the video of this interview. I'd love to find it. I think it was Ludovic Kennedy, who was a British TV interviewer at the time. I'm not 100% sure. And the law is also unusual because it was rejected by the House of Lords. And there is a Parliaments Act 1911-1949, which allows, under certain conditions, the House of Commons to pass a law that the House of Lords has rejected. Very unusual, maybe the only time it's been used. And the War Crimes Act was passed in that way. So the question was raised to the chief rabbis. I recall the interview. It's 50 years after the war. Why not forgive? And the chief rabbi basically, as I recall, responded, we don't have the standing to forgive. I mean, that's one issue. We're not the victims. So that's an interesting question of who has the standing to forgive. Secondly, judgment is not the same thing as revenge or vengeance. Judgment is about justice. And if we don't do this now, before these people pass away and before their victims, the last of their victims pass away, there won't be any more chances for justice at all. And at that point, the interviewer said, but that's not very Christian, Chief Rabbi. And I thought that was a wonderful moment in British public life. So I guess for me, that started me thinking back in 1991, what place is there for both judgment and forgiveness in Judaism? And I think there's a certain stereotype about Judaism that it's only about judgment and not about forgiveness. I don't think that's correct. And even some Jewish thinkers have that view. They think that somehow the view that's put forward, as we'll see in Ramak, in Moshe Cordovero, because it deals with forgiveness, must be something more like a Christian view. I don't think that's correct. I think there's room for an important place for both notions. Now, there's an important philosophical literature about forgiveness. if we were doing a real survey of that, we'd have to start with Bishop Butler, who in the Rolls Chapel in London gave a fantastic sermon on the nature of forgiveness. But I'm not going to go all the way back to that. I will go to something much more recent, which is Sir Peter Strawson's important essay, Freedom and Resentment. This was the 1962 British Academy lecture. And Strawson says the following, and although there's room for some disagreement, there's some variation, nevertheless, I think this is a pretty mainstream view that sets the framework for much of the philosophical discussion since that time. He says, to ask to be forgiven is in part to acknowledge that the attitude displayed in our actions was such as might properly be resented. So there's justification for resentment. Some offense was committed. Resentment is justified. And it's in part to repudiate that attitude for the future, or at least for the immediate future. And to forgive is to accept the repudiation and to forswear the resentment. So the picture we get is an offense has been committed. The person against whom the offense has been committed, the victim, is justified in resentment, an attitude of resentment towards the offender. However, forgiveness is repudiating the attitude and forswearing the resentment. So that's a pretty standard view, and it gives rise to what has been called the paradox of forgiveness. This comes from a paper by Aurel Colnay, who unfortunately died after giving this lecture, and it was published posthumously, but I think it's been quite influential. Colnay at the Aristotelian Society in 1973 said the following. I mean, it's meant to be provocative. It's not his view. He's trying to stimulate us by giving us a paradox. Either the wrong is still flourishing, the offense still subsisting, then by forgiving, you accept it and thus confirm it and make it worse. That's one side of the paradox. Or the wrongdoer has suitably annulled and eliminated his offense. And then by harping on it further, you would set up a new evil. And by forgiving, you would only acknowledge the fact that you're no longer its victim. Briefly, forgiveness is either unjustified or pointless. So, in brief, part A, if the resentment is justified by an offense, then repudiating the attitude through forgiveness would seem to amount to condoning the offense. And how can it be justified to condone the offense? So in that case, forgiveness is unjustified. B, if the offender repents and apologizes for the offense and corrects their behavior, then resentment is unjustified. But in that case, forgiveness is redundant. What are you doing forgiving if resentment is unjust? If the person has changed already, what is that still to forgive? The offense is gone. So again, this is, I think, a deliberately provocatively stated paradox. And I think there are many ways to address it. But the one that I'm going to deal with, which I identify in the Mussar classic Tomer Devorah, is to distinguish and clarify two different kinds of forgiveness. The first I'll call judgmental forgiveness. That acknowledges the justification of the negative attitude, yet it also repudiates the attitude. And of course, you have to explain, if you're giving an account of this sort of forgiveness, how the repudiation of the attitude differs from condoning the offense.
Call this question. Is that
yes. Go on.
Just clarifying question. Can you sort of give some background or a context for the work that resentment is doing for Strawson rather than something like blame? So I could imagine swapping out resentment for properly be blamed for an action. I mean, I understand that Strawson has a particular interest in resent, but why is that important to you or this account? You can just give some sort of color to that.
Yeah, I think actually the distinction that I would make, which is going to be quite an important one, is that blame really has to do with locating responsibility for a specific action or a specific state of affairs. Resentment is the disruption of a relationship. And that's really central to what I want to say, that the judgmental forgiveness really deals with the whole thing basically from a legal perspective. You could imagine it happening in something like a tribunal or a court of law. And it does not presuppose any context of relationship between the offender and the victim. But what I'm going to call non-judgmental forgiveness involves a relationship. So resentment, I think that it doesn't really, Strawson's account doesn't distinguish these two different things. Resentment is the disruption of a pre-existing relationship, or it's the expression of an attitude as a kind of hostile relationship or something like that. But I think it has to be understood in terms of an ongoing interaction, an ongoing relationship between the two parties. Does that help?
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine that someone who doesn't have an ex-ante relationship with me might do something that, they're to blame for, but maybe that would interrupt my resentment because I didn't really have a pre-existing relationship with them. So yeah, I want to, yeah, this is really fascinating. Thank you. I'm want to think about this.
Okay, good. Yeah, thank you for the question. So yeah, judgmental forgiveness, which is A on the slide, has to do with repudiating the negative attitude, however exactly we want to characterize that. So I didn't use the word resentment there. So it might be that the person apologizes, or the person compensates you in some way, right? And there's some sort of gesture that is made by the offender that is met with forgiveness on the part of the victim. And what the victim is saying is, even though there was justification for the negative attitude that I had, nevertheless, I am repudiating that now in light of your change, whatever change it is that you have made. And because of that, I don't think that's the same thing as condoning the offense, because it seems to require that the offender do something, whether it's apologize or give compensation or whatever it is. The second kind of forgiveness is not judgmental at all. It's something else. I'll be saying a lot more about that. And judgment is one of the main topics of the Yom Noraim, of the High Holy Days, and it's very relevant to this whole account. Right? Non-judgmental forgiveness resists or overcomes the sense that the offense justifies resentment at all. It takes a totally different attitude. And we're going to see that in Ramak, in Moshe Cordovero, that there's a way of, it's a challenging way. It's a massively challenging ethical aspiration, a way of overcoming one's own judgmental standpoint and adopting a different attitude altogether towards the offender. And obviously that will have to be something more than the mere theoretical registering that the offender has repented. It's something different from that. And we'll try and say what it is. And Moshe Cordovero tries to make some distinction like this, it seems to me, and it's based on the Zohar and his reading of the Zohar. And the main focus of the book is non-judgmental forgiveness. So that's what I'm going to really focus on. I think you can find in other parts of the tradition, maybe especially in the Rambam, in Maimonides, an account of judgmental forgiveness. But Moshe Cordovero is doing something else entirely and trying to get us to at least aspire to overcome the judgmental attitude altogether. There's also a very good literature about forgiveness that came out of the project of reconciliation after the apartheid in South Africa. And there's a very good series of papers by the South African philosopher Lucy Allais. One of them is called Wiping the Slate Clean, the Heart of Forgiveness. And here she mentions what she takes to be the Jewish view, and she takes it to be the Jewish view because it's put forward that way by the author of a book, Solomon Schimmel, and it's a useful book, but I think there's some limitations to his account. So here's what Lucy Allais says. It might be thought that forgiveness can be located here, where the perpetrator has undone the damage she caused, enabling us rationally to give up resentment without changing our belief that she did wrong. This kind of approach is presented by Schimmel. So that's what I call judgmental forgiveness, who argues that within Jewish thought is generally regarded as wrong to forgive unrepentant sinners, right? Because then you're just condoning the sin. That's one side of Kolnai's paradox. It would be weird to forgive without some kind of act on the part of the offender. And that for some wrongs also, Schimmel says, forgiveness is conceptually impossible. Now, this has to do with the issue of who has the standing to apologize. Well, the victim does. Well, the murder victim is not able to forgive because they're dead. And who has the standing to forgive on their behalf, right? So murder is regarded as unforgivable because the only person who could be in a position to forgive is no longer around to do it, and because the harm cannot be undone. But that if perpetrators are truly repentant and have made appropriate and proportional restitution, forgiveness is obligatory. So that's the general picture of what the Jewish position is. I say it's not the only Jewish position. It is an important Jewish position. It's judgmental forgiveness. It's the first kind. And Schimmel himself does mention Moshe Cordovero, but here's what he says. He says the overall perspective of Cordovero's teachings is similar to the Christian approaches that many Jews have found to be inappropriate responses to insult and injury. Be that as it may, Cordovero is solidly within the Jewish tradition of ethical teachings, even though his view is a minority one. And I don't think that's really adequate. I think it's pretty solidly within the Jewish tradition. It's a very different level of forgiveness. And I want to just, instead of just saying, well, it's a minority, I want to say there's both judgmental forgiveness and there's non-judgmental forgiveness. So we can have both. Judgmental forgiveness is obligatory when it's relevant. If somebody has offended you in some way, they've committed some harm against you, and they do apologize or they do genuinely make restitution of some kind, then it is an obligation to forgive them in the judgmental sense. And that's not condoning the offense because they've done something to show that they are regretted, that they're not going to do it again, and so on. But there's this other notion of non-judgmental forgiveness, and that I want to say is relevant only in the context of a relationship, an ongoing relationship. It's also an aspirational ideal. We can't really say that it's an obligation. It's very difficult and challenging, psychologically, ethically challenging, but these are both Jewish responses. That's the overall view. Let me say something about Tomer Devorah. Obviously, we're not going to be able to give a close reading of the whole work in the time that we have, but Moshe Cordovero lived from 1522 to 1570. He was by far the most distinguished teacher and writer of Kabbalah in his lifetime. Pardes Rimonim, which is his first work, which was done in a very early age, is an incredible digest and survey overview of the whole Iberian Kabbalistic tradition. Moshe Cordovero was either one of the exiles from Iberia or maybe was a child of the exiles, not long after the expulsion anyway. And Tomer Devorah comes out a bit later. It was published after his death. The first edition was published in Venice in 1589. In general, his works were brought to Italy in order to be published, and they were incredibly influential. And I won't say an awful lot more about the history of publication, but there's some interest in it. And the other edition that I show you a picture of here is from Königsberg in 1858. And I put that there because Rabbi Strawson, the founder of the Mussar movement, that was, a revival tradition, a revival movement in ethics and ethical writings, had this particular edition published. And the book is very central to the Mussar movement that influenced my own education a great deal, particularly the tradition that comes from the Talmud Torah of Kelm, where some of my teachers or their teachers were educated. It was standard to learn Tomer Devorah every Friday night. And it was particularly common to study it in the Aseres Yemei Tshuva, the 10 days of repentance, the whole period of Rosh Hashanah leading up to Yom Kippur. Why is it called Tomer Devorah? Why is it called the palm tree of Deborah? What does that have to do with it? Well, you'll recall that Deborah was a prophet, but she was also a judge. Right? She judged Israel at that time. And we're told in the book of Shoftim, book of Judges, that he Yosheves Tachas Tomer Devorah, she used to sit under the palm of Deborah, and it tells you exactly where, and the Israelites would come to her for decisions, for judgment. Okay, that tells you the origin of the phrase, but doesn't really explain everything. Clearly, Devorah stands for judgment or din. She's a judge. And in fact, if you look in Pardes Rimonim, in Moshe Cordovero's earlier work, one of the major chapters is a lexicon of terms that are important in Kabbalah. And under the term tamar, he says the following. He says, there are male palms and female palms, and therefore no palm tree produces fruit unless it has a corresponding male. And both are explained in the verse, Tzadik katama yifrach, the righteous blooms like a palm. And then he quotes the same pasuk that we just talked about, the same verse, but he Yosheves Tachas Tomer Devorah, and she used to sit under the palm tree of Deborah. And he says, Hari Zachar and Keva, these are male and female. So I take it that on his understanding, the term Tomer, which is from Tamar, is a male term of non-judgment, and that's equivalent to the tzaddik, to the righteous person. It's also the ninth sphera. We'll talk about that in a minute, the sphera of Yesod. So that's a non-judgmental power, shall we say, whereas Devorah is female in gender and represents judgment, and she stands there for the 10th sphera of Malchus, or sovereignty. Again, I'll say more about the spheres in a minute. So Tomer Devorah represents the union of the two, the union of non-judgment and judgment. And I think that's really what the title signifies. And I'll just say that the entire thing that I want to say and the entire Tomer Devorah is all encoded into this fantastic graphic from Kabbalah Denudata, which is a book that I work on by basically Christian Kabbalists with Jewish assistants in Sulzbach, was published in 1677. And if you understand this diagram, you don't need to hear the rest of the shiur. But maybe I'll just survey a little bit about the spheres, although we're not going to talk in huge detail. It is the background for Kabbalistic thinking of this kind. We have 10 spheres, which are powers or manifestations of divinity. And we can divide them up into triads for the most part. The first triad we could call, I'm going to put it in psychological terms. I think how I would explain the spheres really depends on the context. In this context, which is really what in philosophy we would call moral psychology, I'm going to explain it in largely psychological terms, because the spheres are not only manifestations of divinity, they're also the form and structure of the human psyche itself. So the first triad is the three intellectual spheres of Keser, Chochma, and Bina. Sometimes we talk about Das as well as the union of Chochma and Bina. So that's the crown, which is sort of transcending the head, as it were. Chochma is wisdom or insight, and Bina is understanding or discernment. Bina is really a kind of judgment. Chochma is insight. It's more like a flash of insight. It's the first beginning of understanding, but it's not yet a judgment itself. The second triad we could call the emotional triad of Chesed, Gvura, and Tiferes, Chesed, I would say, is a kind of magnanimity. It's an overflow of giving. And Gvura is the restraint. Now, you need both of those. Restraint without magnanimity is not much good. Magnanimity without restraint is also dangerous. So Tiferes is the harmony of the two. It's the balance between magnanimity and restraint. The third triad I will explain here as communicative. Netzach, Hod, and Yisod. Netzach, I would say, is the mastery over the content of what is to be communicated. Often that's associated with Moshe Rabbeinu, with Moses. Hod is the ability to advocate for and convey that content. It's associated with Aaron, with Moshe's brother. We needed both of them. And Yesod, I will say, is something like dissemination. Again, the combination of the two, the mastery over the content and the ability to convey, gives you dissemination of the content. And then finally, at the bottom, we've got Malchus, which is the sovereign domain, or we might say the addressee, if we're thinking about it in communicational terms. So all of this is both the structure of the way in which divinity is manifest at many different levels of reality, and it's also the structure of the human psyche itself. Now, the most important parts of the Zohar for this context, both for Ramak's understanding, Moshe Cordovero's understanding of moral psychology, and later, slightly later, for the Ari, for Rabbi Yitzhak Luria, are the Sifra Tzniuta, Idra Rabbah, and Idra Zuta. Those are clearly connected parts of the Zohar. And what happens in those sections is that the 10 Sfirot that I just mentioned get reorganized into what are called partsufim, physiognomies, I suppose, or faces. And there are 6 of them, but only 2 are going to be really important for our purpose. I'll mention them anyway. There's Atik Yumin, or Atika Kadisha, which is the interior core of Keter, very far removed to the transcendent core, the interior core of the transcendent. Almost nothing to say about that. But then, more importantly, around the outward-facing aspect of Keter, we have Arikh Anpin. And that's just an Aramaic way of saying Erech HaPayim. Right? Erech HaPayim is, you could say, patience, slow breathing, not given to anger. It's a very patient face that is put on the manifestation of divinity, or that we humans, and that's part of the point, can aspire to show to others. Chochmah and Bina become Abba and Ima, father and mother. Again, I won't get into that. Now, the second one that we do need to worry about is Zeir Anpin. So that's an Aramaic phrase which is meant to model Erech HaPayim. So Erech HaPayim is the elongated face, and Zeir Anpin, although that's not based on a Hebrew phrase that's used in Tanakh the way Arikh Anpin is, would be the opposite. It would be fast breathing. It would be given to anger. And that's a partsuf. It's a physiognomy or a face that is built around Tiferes. Tiferes is the dominant sphere. So Arikh Anpin, the dominant sphere, is Keter, which is transcendent. And it's very patient. And Zeir Anpin is a different face that we can show to the world and that God can show to the world, which is impatient and capable of anger. And then Malchus is reorganized in terms of Nukba. I won't get into the details because they're not so important here. But here's an important passage from the Zohar. Hai Atika Atikin, Ikare Arikh Anpin. This ancient of ancients is called Arikh Anpin, the elongated countenance. The Hahu Dilavar Ikare Zeir Anpin. And the exterior one is called Zeir Anpin, the small countenance. Lekable de Atika Saba Kodesh Kadoshim de Kodshaya Zeir Anpin Kad Istaka Lahai Kulalatata Takin. When the small countenance, Zeir Anpin, serves as the recipient of Atika Saba, the Holy of Holies, and when Zeir Anpin looks to that one, when it looks to Arikh Anpin, everything below is rectified. So when the angry face that both God and humans can show, instead of looking with anger at something, looks up at the patient face, everything below is fixed and rectified. So it's that gaze that is very important to the story. And from the same section of the Zohar, we find the following. Siv asher ayin b'ayin nira ata Hashem. It's written, for eye to eye you appear, Hashem. V'ila male eina taba ila da'ashkach v'askele eina tata lo yachel alma l'mekam rega chada. If it were not for this supernal, transcendent eye gazing upon and bathing the lower eye, the world would not be able to endure for a single moment. So it's this gaze between the two different manifestations of God, or the two different manifestations of the human psyche, that allows the world to endure, right? Because the thought is that there would be, the anger would break out, judgmental anger. And I think the picture is that the anger is the expression of resentment, which is justified because of sin. But this is somehow mitigated or modified by the eye-to-eye gaze between the Zeir Anpin on the one hand, the small face, and the Arikh Anpin, the elongated face, the patient persona on the other hand. So I would say that this gaze is what constitutes a loving environment within which alone tikkun or rectification is possible. There's a kind of non-judgmental forgiveness that consists in forgoing the judgmental standpoint altogether. Judgmental standpoint is when from that point of view, yeah, resentment is justified. But what's the alternative? The alternative is a kind of loving gaze. It's a seeing and a being seen. It's a reciprocal gaze. And it can be thought of either as internal to divinity itself, or as internal to each human psyche who achieves this standpoint. And if a human being achieves that internal relationship between their own Zeir Anpin and their own Arikh Anpin, then they will interact with other human beings. They'll have a different kind of relationship with other human beings than would be possible from the judgmental point of view. And it's not about condoning sin. It's about seeing people from this loving point of view as if what really interests you is their development, their ethical, their spiritual development, taking a loving attitude towards that. Again, it's not just theoretical registering that they're changing, it's taking a loving interest in their development. And judgment here, I think, also is not merely passing judgment, but it's something like determining what the concept is that applies to something. It's one of the great powers of human action that it does not have a determinate concept applied to it once and for all, because we can change the narrative. The way you act now, taken in the moment, is one thing, but that action is always part of some narrative that is constructed over a whole series of actions and events, could be many years, and something that is done in the future, later in the series, can change the meaning of that which was done in the past. So it changes the judgmental status. It changes how the act is described, and therefore it changes whether it merits punishment or whether it merits resentment altogether. So seeing the offender or the sinner with this loving attitude that originates within oneself in a kind of self-forgiveness, this allows you to forgo resentment altogether. And that's different from being justified in resentment, but repudiating it, which was Strawson's picture. That's okay. That's judgmental forgiveness. But this is something else. It means I'm not taking a judgmental attitude towards the other person. I am seeing them with love and trying to see what can be done to help them in the development of their story. And part of the development of their story will be changing the way in which their earlier actions are correctly described and changing the judgmental status of those earlier actions. So for Reb Moshe Cordovero in Tomer Devorah, this whole idea of the mutual gaze, which is found in the Idra Rabbah section of Zohar, is the basis of a very demanding ethics. Right? He appeals to the principle of imitatio Dei, emulating divinity. He also presupposes Kabbalistic principle, which goes beyond that, of theurgy, which is that the way we act can change the way in which God acts towards us. We'll come back to that. So at the very beginning of the book, he says, Ha'adam roi she'istam elekono. It's fitting for a human being to resemble their creator. And then they will participate in the mystery of the higher form, both in image and likeness. She'ilu yidome begufo v'lo bif'ulos, because if you were to resemble the creator in body but not in actions, then they would contradict the form, and people would say of them, beautiful form, but ugly actions. That would not be good. So there's a call to resemblance. And then he's going to go on and try to show that, look, the world was not set up by God in such a way that as soon as you sin, the earth swallows you up, or a bolt of thunder and lightning comes and demolishes you. And it could have been. In a world of strict judgment, you could understand that, but it's not the way it is. In fact, God not only restrains that judgment, but actively continues to vitalize the body and the soul of the sinner, keep them alive, and empower them to do what is wrong. So we already resemble the Creator, according to Moshe Cordovero, because our bodies are themselves spherotically structured, and our psyches are spherotically structured. And our actions, for that reason, are going to not only rectify us, but also the cosmic spherotic structure as well. So if we want Hashem to forgive us, there are two things that we might mean. One is judgmental forgiveness, and that's what a lot of the Rosh Hashanah liturgy and so on and Yom Kippur is focused on. We're doing tshuva. We're trying to repent for the things that we did. We're trying to apologize, and so on and so on. And that's all good. But there's a higher level of forgiveness that we can ask from HaKadosh Baruch Hu as well. But in order to get that higher level of non-judgmental forgiveness, we must first show that we can have non-judgmental forgiveness of ourselves and others as well. So if we want Hashem to forgive us in the sense of the mutual gaze, to forgo judgment and justified resentment altogether, then we should act the same way towards other human beings. And that's the basic thought of the book. Let me stop there, and we can see if there are questions and things to discuss. And then what I'm going to do, that was the basic concept of the book. And next week I'm going to talk about the Yud Gimel Midas, the 13 divine attributes, which is the based on what it says in the Zohar. There's two sets of 13 attributes. There's the 13 attributes of Moshe, of Moses, and those are concerned with judgmental forgiveness. But then there are the higher 13 attributes, the Yud Gimel Midas of Micha the prophet, and those are concerned with judgmental forgiveness. And Moshe Cordovero is going to give us an analysis of those 13 midas and how they're related, and that's I think worthwhile and interesting, and very much related to the davening, the liturgy of the High Holy Days. But I'm going to pause here, and I think I've said enough in that way, and we can have some discussion.
Huh?
Yes.
Okay, that's a question. So when you talk about the gaze, is the gaze bodily form? I know it's a merging of the two. The gaze is a merging of the bodily form and the internal, right, forgiveness. But it seems like the gaze, the way you set it up earlier, it seems more like a bodily form imitation. Am I wrong about that?
It's between two different aspects of the divine or human psyche. So human beings are capable of taking on the face of Zeir Anpin, the face of a kind of impatient judgment. And in many situations, that is entirely relevant. So in the case of
The
the
initial gaze, the
Yeah.
initial gaze between two people that you had mentioned earlier when you were explaining it, right?
Mhm.
That is the relationship. It seems like the initial, before words are even spoken, it seems that unless you're saying that the gaze is
the context of the relationship is set by the gaze between Arikh Anpin, which is the patient persona, and Zeir Anpin, which is the impatient. It's not that one chooses one over the other. It's the relationship between the two, right? So it's not saying you should give up judgment altogether, judgment being the function, let's say, of Zeir Anpin. No, there is a role for judgment. But when Arikh Anpin looks at Zeir Anpin, when the patient persona
okay.
looks at in love
Mhm.
at the judgmental persona,
That's
then that judgment is either restrained altogether or it is applied, but it's applied only because it is beneficial to the ethical and spiritual development of the sinner or the offender.
okay. Excellent. Okay.
So we don't get one versus the other. And I see that Howard is asking about an example of a portion of the Rosh Hashanah liturgy, which deals with non-judgmental forgiveness. And yes, so that is, you will find in Tashlich. It's not really the central focus of the main prayers at all. The main prayers are definitely about judgmental forgiveness. But in Tashlich, you will find that the focus is on the 13 midas, the 13 attributes of Micha, not the 13 attributes of Moshe. And the way they are usually printed in the Siddur, I don't have an image to show you, but I'll do that next time. It's in the next set of slides. They're set up so they're correlated so that one set of midas is in big letters and the other one is in small letters. Now, of course, those midas of Micha are also featured, if I recall correctly, at certain points in the Rosh Hashanah davening, but it's really only in Tashlich. And I assume that although the practice of Tashlich is probably earlier and originated in Ashkenaz, I assume that the text that we say today, with the Yud Gimel Midas, the 13 attributes, is later and Kabbalistically influenced. But that's where we see it. Tashlich, what we're asking for is non-judgmental forgiveness. And I know Zev had his hand up.
Yeah, thank you. So just you'd started with an articulation of the worry about the paradox of forgiveness. And I imagine that we're going to see the resolution of that next week.
Yes.
But I was hoping just to get so that I can remember for next week, like what are the key elements to remember in the sort of trajectory of that argument to resolve the paradox?
Yeah, well, I think we can already say it now because I can go back to this slide probably. Let's see. Yeah. See if this works. Okay, so the resolution is that there are two kinds of forgiveness, which are not properly distinguished by Strawson, but which I think are distinguished in the tradition that I'm talking about from Tomer Devorah. So on the one hand, there is judgmental forgiveness. And there, yeah, the negative attitude is justified, and yet it's repudiated. And I would say the reason why that repudiation is not condoning the offense is because it's only repudiated if the offender takes some steps to rectify the situation, whether it's through apology whether it's through compensation, restitution, or something like that. So that's one that deals with one side of the paradox. The other side of the paradox, I say, is also not really paradoxical. It's just something else. It's non-judgmental forgiveness, or I would say it's foregoing resentment because it's foregoing judgment altogether. So that's different from saying the resentment is justified, which is a judgmental claim, but I'm repudiating it anyway. This is saying I'm not even taking that sort of attitude towards the offender at all, right? And again, I said it's not merely registering that the offender has repented adequately as a sort of theoretical observation. So the way I want to explain that, which we'll see more when we look at the Tomer Devorah text next time, is that there's a relationship in place. And that's animated by a spirit of love and an attention exemplified by the sort of by the mutual gaze. It's an attitude of love towards the offender, in whose ethical and spiritual development one takes an interest. And again, I want to say that's not totally incompatible with judgment either. It's just that judgment from this point of view will only be relevant to the extent that it is beneficial to the spiritual development or the ethical and spiritual development of the offender. Whereas from the first point of view, judgmental forgiveness, it's got nothing to do with whether it's beneficial or not, right? It is a question of what is owed. It's an obligation. It's an obligation to forgive if the offending act has been rectified in some way. So that's the short answer. So if I go back to what Kolnai said, maybe this will be clearer. Right? He said, either the wrong is still flourishing, the offense still subsisting, then by forgiving you accept it and thus confirm it and make it worse. Or the wrongdoer has suitably annulled and eliminated his offense, and then by harping on it further, you would set up a new evil, and by forgiving, you'd only acknowledge the fact that you're no longer its victim. So forgiveness is either unjustified or pointless. So I'm saying that you can pull those two parts apart from one another. There's a kind of forgiveness, non-judgmental forgiveness, that pertains even when the wrong is still flourishing. Right? It is an overcoming of the judgmental attitude altogether. And then what you're concerned with in a loving way is whether the person will develop. I mean, I think it's quite natural to think about this in parent-child relationship. There might be times when I feel that my children are too old for this now, but when I feel that my children might benefit from my showing them a strict face, and I might not even feel that bothered by what they're doing internally, but showing them a certain judgmental attitude may be part of my interest, my loving interest in their development. That's not a judgmental forgiveness. That's really a non-judgmental forgiveness, but judgment can play a role in it as well.
So yeah, so if I'm getting this right, you're sort of doubling down on Strawson's interpretation to say that Kolnai isn't actually articulating an issue with Strawson if we take on the perspective of non-judgmental forgiveness, because Strawson's correct in the last phrase to say to forgive is to forswear resentment, or is there's the mechanism there of turning that what otherwise would be resentment into a kind of love.
But I think it does point to a problem in Strawson's formula. Strawson does not make the distinction that I'm trying to make, and he seems to run the two together. So he puts it all in terms of resentment, which, as I say, is really a relational notion.
Yeah.
Whereas I want to separate that out from the more, shall we say, legalistic notion, which does not necessarily involve resentment at all. You know, somebody damaged my property, and now I want them to make it good. And if they make it good, I'll forgive them. But I don't have to have anything to do with them. I may not even feel resentful towards them in the first place, because maybe I have a good relationship with them, except the fact that they damaged my property. But that's different from the situation where you have an ongoing loving relationship with someone, and the offense is a breach in the relationship. And then the question is, how is this breach going to be repaired in a way that benefits the development of the person?
Oh, thank you.
Noah.
Yeah. You hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I have one question. According to the view that you presented here, like the way to forgive is to reframe the sin, like the situation of the sin or the sinner. My question is, according to Cordovero, there is like a norms regarding what is the right frame, or there isn't such a thing, like the right frame. What is the frame that I need to embrace now? Is there a correct one, or I can like decide myself? I need to embrace that framing and not the other.
Okay, great. Yeah. So I don't think there's only one sort of canonical way to frame actions. There are different narratives. Obviously, the way Moshe Cordovero is thinking, for him, there's a master narrative, which is the the Kabbalistic narrative of the tikkun, the rectification of the cosmos, and so on. And everything is going to fit into that. It's the rectification of the cosmos. So there's the rectification of the exile, and your own individual rectification is going to fit or in that nested series of narratives somehow. But I don't know that we need to put it that way, just within an individual narrative. I think there are some general things we can say about how human beings understand their lives. And it has a narrative structure. And the way in which you frame it, and I'm not limiting that to any particular set of ways, can change the significance of an action, even retrospectively, long after that action has been performed. And I think that in itself is an interesting philosophical ground for arguing against a certain kind of naturalism, which would try to ultimately base actions on events as natural occurrences. Actions have a very special character in that they're, as I say, even though there may be a determinate concept and judgment that applies in context at the time of performance, that is something that can be changed retrospectively when the narrative setting is changed. But I think we have a great deal of latitude in human life about how we tell those stories.
So the question whether the sin I did yesterday is a big sin or a small sin or something insignificant now, there's no absolute answer to that.
No, and maybe it's not even, it may still be a sin, but it may be, oh, in retrospect, that was the moment when you had this fantastic possibility that opened up for you of transforming your life, entering into a new relationship with someone, or transforming your relationship with someone.
Yeah.
So it can take on a totally different valence. Jake.
So I'm interested in the fact that even when an individual forgives someone, excuse me, the police or the courts or the state still apply a punishment. I mean, that is, you can't just say, it's all right, we worked it out between ourselves, officer, you can go home. That really there's still sometimes a need to punish someone, and that I don't even think, I could be wrong, but that states, legal systems, police are in the business of forgiving someone. It often seems like something that happens in private life. I mean, I suppose there are presidential pardons and things like that. But so I'm curious, is there any recognition or is there any attention to that distinction in Cordovero between, what the authorities and those who are meting out punishment, between the view they take and then the view we take in private life, or is it sort of all one thing?
Yeah, he doesn't really distinguish, but I think it's possible for us to do so in a way that he would have accepted. So, I think there's some idea that the work of the law has to be seen to be done. So, there are some contexts where prior to forgiveness, if it's just an offense between two individuals, that the court is operating more as a tribunal than anything else. But if the court is acting as a sort of arm of the state and enacting punishment, which in his day the rabbinic courts were not really able to do, then you can't just forgive in that way. It's an important aspect of public policy that the correct punishment has to be seen to be done. And I think you mentioned pardons. I think those are fascinating. And of course, one of the interesting things from a foreigner's perspective about the American system is the pardon power, which is so much greater than that exists in the monarchies that I'm familiar with. And there are different pictures, I think, of what the pardon power is. So one picture would be that the sovereign is very much like a certain picture of God and arbitrary. And the very arbitrariness manifests the power of the monarch or of God. And so this, on a good day, when the king's in a good mood, he's going to pardon a bunch of people but because he can, right? A different picture, which I think many of us have had, whether it's still appropriate, I don't know, of the way it's meant to work in America, is that, look, we all know that there is procedural justice when due process is followed and so on. And there's also substantive justice, which is whether you get the right result. And there are cases in which, although the procedure was followed, and therefore there's no real appeal that's going to be successful, on investigation, you can find that the wrong result was attained. And in that case, some kind of clemency or pardon is justified. It has to be both within the system and yet not really. It has to be outside the procedure. So I think those are two very different pictures of how pardon or clemency works. And I think we should probably stop there. Thank you to everyone. And if you enjoyed this, then come back next week.
Thank you, Paul. Feel better. And
Thank
thank you
you.
for this wonderful share. Okay. Okay. Okay,
I
Paul, you
didn't-
can stop you could stop the recording now. Okay, good.
Yeah,
Okay, you stopped the recording
I did not.
on the bottom.
Yeah, I'm trying
where
to
it
find
says
it.
record.
Okay.